Hello BookTube, welcome or welcome back to my channel. I'm Marilyn and I'm glad you stopped by. I'm commemorating 5 years on BookTube and my 75th birthday, and last week I did a video that got a lot of views, so thank you very much for liking and commenting, and of course if I have any new subscribers, thank you so much. But I did the 5 best books that I've read in my 5 years here on BookTube. And of course there were many more, but I had to pick 5. And this week I'm going to take a different turn, maybe a darker turn, for sure a darker turn, and talk about the 5 most disturbing books that I've read since joining BookTube. And this with some caveats, in that some of these books are in different forms. Some of these books I read and I couldn't finish, but I thought needed to be read, and I bought them in book form or read them again. But in between are books that aren't that disturbing. So the last book is controversial and the most disturbing. So if you want to not watch that part, I'll forgive all of you. Who am I to forgive any of you? I'm going to start with a very disturbing book that I bought at a book sale, and I initially had to hide it in a closet because I didn't want to read it, because I knew that it would affect me very deeply. But during the last year, in fact, I took it out of the closet, and I had read a few. These are letters, and I had read a few letters when I first got it from, while browsing in the library book sale. But this time I read it from beginning to end, and I felt like putting it back in the closet. But let me tell you what it is. It's Final Letters from Victims of the Holocaust, selected by Reuven, Dafni, and Yehudit Kleiman. And let me just show you. The cover is pretty grim. So it shows like torn pieces of paper, and of course there's the train tracks that held the cattle cars taking these victims to their death, mostly. And this says that it's the devastating collection of letters Jews wrote during the Holocaust, selected from the Yad Vashem archives, stands as a memorial to all who died under the Nazis. On the way to their deaths, Jews, the inmates of camps, ghettos, and prisons, tried to transmit some information about their fate to their relatives and friends. They wrote on whatever scraps of paper they can find and left these messages in hiding places or dropped them from deportation trains. Decades passed before many of these letters reached their destination. Some are final farewells, last signs of life. Others show hope mixed with dreadful uncertainty, deeply personal messages or historical records for coming generations. Philosophical or mundane, all show dignity and courage. And what's so devastating about this book, what's so disturbing, is that we go into each person's life as human beings, not as just a number who died in the Holocaust, who were murdered in the Holocaust. We go into different personalities and different family structures. And I'm just going to read what they picked on the back of the book. And it's dated July 7th, 1944. My dear beloved little child, on giving birth to you, my darling, I did not imagine that 6.5 years later I would be writing you such a letter. When I last saw you on your 6th birthday, December 13th, 1943, I had the illusion that I would still be able to see you before my departure, but now I know this cannot be. I do not want to endanger you. We are leaving on Monday. Now it is Friday evening. We are going, Daddy, Paula, and I, with 50 other fellow nationals, to an unknown destination. I do not know, my dear child, if I will ever see you again. So you can see how devastating these letters are, reading them now, when we know what happened to these people. I'm going to read you just part of another letter that is also on the cover. And it says, October 16th, 1944, 6:15 p.m. My dear brother, goodbye. Think of our talk that night. I felt as one with you. I know that if it were you whose life would end, I would go on living, as I had lost half of my body and soul. You said that. If I die, you will kill yourself. Think of what I told you, that if you stay alive, I will live on within you. I would have liked to continue my life with you and with our family. Plans, desires, hopes were before me. I longed for the unknown. I would have liked to know, to live, to see, to do, to love. But now it is all over. In the city, Jews were exterminated from entire streets. There is no escape. So I'm not going to read it further, but it's so heartbreaking that I don't know if I'll ever read it again. But I think it's worth reading to get a personal glimpse at these people, that they're humans, and they weren't treated as humans, obviously. But it is, especially for someone like me and many others who lost family members that we would never meet in the Holocaust, they're particularly heartbreaking, of course. But for anyone, I think, who believes in just human decency, life, I think it's a disturbing book for sure, but maybe an important book. Now, the next book that I'm going to talk about is not even any way, shape, or form as disturbing as the first one that I talked about. And I don't have the book. I read it on Kindle, and I'll have it here. It's called Now in November, and it's by Josephine Winslow Johnson. And she won the Pulitzer Prize in 1935. It was printed in 1934, and that was years before The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck was written. And she was only 24 years old. So a lot of the problems that I had with the book, and there were a few problems, were because I think she's so young, and she was a poet, and it was still beautifully done. But the fact that hardly anyone that I knew before BookTube knew about this book shows that it should be read more often, discussed more broadly. And I heard about this book from Kim of MIDDLEoftheBookMARCH, who loved it, and I didn't love it as much as she did. But let me tell you a little bit about it and why it disturbed me. So we follow the protagonist. I think we pronounce her name as Margette, and she's the middle of three sisters. So she's a middle child, and her family, as they move to a mortgaged farm during the Great Depression and Dust Bowl, facing increasing hardship and personal tragedy. Now, what I said was that Now in November to me was relentlessly tragic and disturbing, but yet poetic and beautiful. And I don't know if I just said this, pardon my age, but Josephine Johnson, beside being 23, she was a poet. So if you like books with very lyrical, poetic language, you will love this book. The problems I had, it had nothing to do with the language, which was beautiful. And the story, well, I'll get into that. What was the story? So I'm going to start with some of her own words so you can see how poetic she was. This is one of the most famous lines, I think, of the book. And she's talking about the land that they encountered when coming to this place. The earth was overwhelmed with beauty and indifferent to it, and I went with a heart ready to crack for its unbearable loveliness. So there are wonderful quotes, or I shouldn't say quotable words and lines in this book. another one that struck me was, and is true to me, what I find is true, what I think is true. The things we felt most are hardest to put into words. Hate is always easier to speak of than love. How shall I make love go through the sieve of words and come out something besides a pulp? And I think this is apropos to autumn is coming in most of the United States. And we don't have a proper autumn in Hawaii, but if you love autumn, and I used to love autumn when I lived in New York and in Minnesota, this autumn is like both an end and a beginning to our lives, and those days which seemed confused with the blur of all things too near and too familiar are clear and strange now. So we follow these three sisters and her mother, her father. They're all very different. A lot of important concepts or themes are discussed that I think are very ahead of its time, and also ahead of a 23-year-old girl, which is one of her sisters is mentally ill, and and I'll explain why it didn't work for me a lot. Her father is older, having to work the land, having to work this land that's so hard, and it's almost like we feel the dryness of the land, how hard it is to work, especially as the book goes on. And also there's also a thirst, literally and figuratively, of life itself and the end of suffering. So we go through a year. It's actually 10 years, but it starts in November and it ends in November. And they're more hopeful in the beginning. They love the land, they love the beauty, and the author describes the beauty that they encounter in this mortgaged property with such lyrical beauty that it's wonderful to read. And of course it gets worse and worse. And I think some people might say that there's no hope. It's very depressing. It's disturbing. But then when we read other accounts of the Depression and the Dust Bowl, and how these were middle class farmers. They mostly always had food until, and I'm not going to go into the end, but there's never any hope in this book. There's unrequited love when a hand is someone to help with the farming has to be hired. Really, he doesn't get paid, but he has food and board, and he falls in love with one of the sisters, and not the sister in the middle who is in love with him. So that's where the unrequited love comes from. But what didn't work for me and was most disturbing to me was that the characters are never fully formed for me. We're in the voice of Margot, and she considers herself plain and maybe not worthy as her two other sisters, and she's very introspective, and she falls in love with the farm hand because he's an introspective person himself, but he's in love with one of the other sisters. But yet we never really understand exactly what happens to the mentally ill sister. It's almost like a dream of what happens and what they're thinking and the terrible things that go on until maybe the end of the book, where I'm not going to spoil it for you, where so it doesn't have a big plot is what I'm saying. The whole story really revolves around this land and trying to make something on this land, to make it work, to make a living, to make their home, their family not be destroyed. And yeah, so some people think that it's a depressing novel. It bothered me, it disturbed me. I wanted just a little bit of hope, and I didn't get it there. So that's why it disturbed me. However, remember, this writer was 24. She won the Pulitzer Prize. And this book is well worth reading. I'm glad I read it. So that's now in November. Now we're going to get to a book I read with a booktuber who doesn't film much anymore, or I should say post much anymore. Her name is Sarah. I hope she comes back. Her channel was Roadworthy. And we read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, the modern Prometheus, in a different form. I couldn't find this, I don't have this book, but I found this at the library. And it's, I had a beautiful edition from the library, but it was what they call a literary commentary. So I really was able to go into Frankenstein because I had always thought, this is not a book for me. I'm not going to read about a monster named Frankenstein. It wasn't the monster who was Frankenstein. But with the help of the commentary and with Sarah, who wanted to read this book really, really badly, and it convinced me that I would love this book, and I did love this book. So what is it about? Now I'm probably, preaching to the choir here. So it tells the story of Victor Frankenstein, he's Frankenstein, not the monster that he creates. He's a scientist who creates what they call a sapient creature, a creature with intelligence, in an unorthodox scientific experiment that involved, it was really gross in a way, putting together different body parts from like autopsies or from dead people. He creates this grotesque, large, humanoid creature, and when the creature awakens, he's scared. He flees in terror, and he returns the next day to find that the monster has disappeared. So we kind of know this, but what I didn't know at all, I thought it was a monster movie in the 50s. I didn't know anything about Mary Shelley, how she created this story when she was very young, just like the other author, Josephine. Let me make sure. Josephine Winslow Johnson. They were also, I think she was like 18 or 20. So it's an amazing, amazing accomplishment. But so when he runs away, the monster, he discovers fire, learns to avoid humans who find him frightening. And he finds like a hovel attached to a small house. So he's allowed to observe this family. He learns to read. He learns to be human, what it means to be human. But then he also learns that he's never going to be accepted by humans. So I'll let you decide what the moral of the story is. That maybe that science can solve not human, but problems of the soul, and maybe it means something else. It means a lot of things, I think. And I really enjoyed this book, but yeah, it was sad. I cried. It was disturbing to me. And if you've read Frankenstein and you found it beautiful yet disturbing, because that's a thing too, I felt really sad for the monster, and I felt really mad at Frankenstein, the man. And you can also think of it as man versus animal too, where we feel sorry for animals that are abused, and humans are supposed to take care of animals and not harm them. And that's kind of how I personally felt about the monster. I think that if Frankenstein had, I don't know, this is just my imagination, had maybe not run away, but maybe tried to talk to, teach the monster, maybe it wouldn't have turned out that way, but maybe not. Maybe it was a lesson to him not to do that because it was against the social order of things. There's a lot of meanings to Frankenstein, yeah, but it is certainly disturbing in parts. And okay, so what is the next? My next disturbing book is a book that I've read in another form, and it frightened me in another form, and that's Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. And this is the form I read it in. I have quite a few copies of this book, but I had never read the play. And the play was called 10 Little Indians, a mystery play in 3 acts by Agatha Christie. And it almost reads, well, I got this also at a library sale, and it almost reads like a script, which is exciting. And also, let me just mention again, Angelia, who's doing Read and Reread, who's doing endless drama. And I'm reading a lot of plays lately, I just want to tell you. And what I liked about it in the beginning, this was Samuel French Incorporated, and it tells you all the places that it was performed. And I know I had it at a place where it was, I don't know if it was first performed there, but it was first performed at the Broadhurst Theater, New York, in June 27th, 1944. And it has the cast. So it almost reads like a playbill. If you know about Broadway, you're given a playbill, and it almost tells you. And it tells you who played all the parts, the scene, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. I didn't know that Agatha Christie had written this in also play form. So what is the 10 Little Indians, which was, the title was revised to And Then There Were None, because the first title was very racist, as this title is, but even more racist, if you can imagine that. So I think you know the premise. This book scared me, so that was disturbing. So I'm just going to give you a short synopsis, that 10 strangers are lured to an isolated island by an anonymous host, only to be accused via a gramophone recording of past murders they escape punishment for. As the storm isolates them, they are killed one by one in ways that mirror a nursery rhyme, leading the few survivors to realize the killer is one of its own. That was really scary. You know, the funny part is when I read it again, I really didn't guess who the murderer was. Yeah, and I have And Then There Were One. This to me was the scariest of the covers of And Then There Were None, for reasons I won't spoil right now. So now I'm going to get to the 5th book. Now, like I said, this book is controversial. This book is violent. This book is also has sexual content in it, which I won't go into detail. But let me tell you that my story of how I encountered this book. Now, as I told you before, I lost 2 great aunts in the Holocaust, and my mother, who was Jewish, tried to keep me away from anything about Holocaust. And that was true to many Jewish mothers in the 50s and 60s, because they didn't want their children to have trauma, not realizing that there is something called intergenerational trauma. That is trauma that we feel from the generations. I truly believe this is true. But, and I don't know if this is an accident, I had a very good friend. She was Irish. Her name was Patricia Cahill. Very Irish, New York family. Was my best friend in the projects. One of my best friends in the projects. And when I say the projects, they don't call it the projects anymore. They call it housing development. But some people still call it the projects. And that's where poor people lived because of various reasons. And this was in the 50s. And she had this book in her bookcase. And I read a few I don't know if it's even in chapters, but I read this book and I was totally disturbed, totally frightened out of my mind, because it is about the Holocaust. With a caveat, it's controversial. During my 5 years on BookTube, I said I wanted to have this book because I had read it when I was, or didn't read it. I read some of it when I was 15, and it was my first encounter with the Holocaust in literature, or really in anywhere else. And it's called House of Dolls. I paid quite a lot for this book. And it's controversial because it's not nonfiction memoir as it's purported to be, even though the author testified at, and I think of it's Eichmann's trial, or one of the top Nazis' trials. And yet, when this was an original where they didn't know that this was not totally nonfiction. And it just says that over 5 million copies have been sold of this nightmare diary of Nazi terror by K. Sisnick 13563. And a lot of people wrote a lot of good things about it. So it says it's sold over 5 million copies and has been translated into more than 16 languages. And and I found out it's still studied in Israel in school. So the premise of the book, before I go into the controversy, now I don't read Holocaust fiction, so this is disturbing on that, if it was fiction, which it was proved to be sort of fiction. So the premise of this book is Daniela Prelesnik, a 14-year-old Jewish girl, left her home in Poland one day in 1939 and never returned. Her subsequent life was spent in the ghetto and labor camps and in the House of Dolls, one of the houses of prostitution set up by the Nazis for their armed forces. Based on an authentic diary, House of Dolls, with its hideous revelations and characters such as Daniela's blonde Aryan torturess, here called Elsa, is the most appalling and famous confession on record of the terror that finally broke the millions of men and women who were savaged by Europe's great catastrophe. So it sounds pretty horrible. And it was written in the 50s. It was first printed in 1956. And from the first page it says that there's a Hebrew edition, a Swedish, Japanese, Spanish, Czech, German, and I'm sure many, many more. So what's the problem with this book? Is it true? Well, that's the thing. We don't know if it's totally true. So, but the person who wrote it, his real name was Yehiel De-Nur, and he wrote under that pen name of Cade Sidnick with the numbers. The book describes joy divisions, alleged brothels, and Nazi concentration camps where Jewish women were forced into sexual slavery for the pleasure of Nazi soldiers. There's a lot of problems with that. Nazis were forbidden to have any kind of physical contact with Jewish women. So that doesn't sound right from there. Also, it was also found out that he never had a sister. So it's not her diary. And he finally admitted, because he is a survivor, he was a survivor, that this was a compilation of things that he saw in his time in a concentration camp. So is it fiction or is it not fiction? we don't know. In fact, the Joy Division, which was mentioned in the book, was actually, I read somewhere that a punk rock group took it as their name, which I don't know how nice that is, but, you know, that's just an aside. But I'm sure that things like this that were described happened. I don't know if he personally witnessed them, but I read them in other books. So this book disturbed me, but excuse me, but it disturbed me enough that I said I needed to buy it and read it for myself. And I read it within these 5 years with a different outlook than my 15-year-old brain. So please let me know in the comments, have you read any of these disturbing books? Maybe they're not disturbing to you. In some of them aren't disturbing to you. Some of them you might not have heard of. Please let me know. And please give a like to this video. My son, my youngest son, who just turned 45 yesterday, told me that likes are more important than anything else on BookTube. I don't know, for the algorithm. I don't know if that's true or not, but he told me it's true. So please like, comment, and say hello in the comments, please. And subscribe if you find this, you know, content interesting in any way. I also plan to do more of this introspective, looking back on these 5 years on BookTube, because there are so many books that I never would have picked up, because, like I said in my last video, were it not for BookTube. So I'm so grateful, not to mention to all my friends here who are so important to me now, and make me want to continue throughout my 75th year, and just keep on growing in mentally, physically, and emotionally, because, you know, it's never too late to learn, to grow, to be a better person. So thank you so much if you watched to the end. If you didn't watch to the end, I understand. It's really, even the cover of this book it's pulp, you know, so it's pulp, and it's almost like they wanted to sell as many books as possible, and I don't think you need to do that with if it was a Holocaust memoir. But anyway, I'll say aloha for now until my next video.